Howdy, folks. It's Glade. Been a hot second, and while I wanted to do more original shit for you, shit hit the fan in my life, so I've been swamped, even more so than usual. So instead, I've some clips from a really wonderful conversation I had with my friend Ocean, talking about the ways gender and divinity interact, and later some lovely topics about how to look at gender historically responsibly. Oh, and really quick, before we get into it, I am starting a podcast with my friends Fishy and Sigrun. It's called the Heathen Bitches Podcast. We ran about things in heathenry. Episode 1 is up right now. Go check it out, please. Link is in the description. Okay. The first clip that starts as we are talking about Skathi in regards to her transness as a deity and the arguments put forth for her transness as given by an examination of myth.
It's a mythic literalist stance, saying that this god was described as a man in this myth, and then they were described as a woman in a later myth. And so that clearly is the same deity having a transition over time. There's no way that these two cultures may have just interpreted the deity differently.
I don't think that's necessarily mythic literalist, though. You could say that the deity presented in one way at one point, and then that presentation changed in a different location or something like that, and then you could say that the deity winds up being like trans or gender fluid or whatever.
Yeah, so, you could say that.
I don't think that it winds up being mythic literalist. That's all I'm saying. It's
okay. That's a fair critique, I suppose. And you could say that. At the same time, then you're getting to the point of like, when you take that approach, still looking at like sources to say it, and it's a different presentation. Well, how much of that presentation actually aligns with the identity? Right? Mm-hmm. How much of this is the gods trying to connect with us and us being creatures with gender? They
trying to interpret them. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
You know?
Because we don't have access to the mind of the deity, so we don't know what exactly the deity, whether or not that presentation has anything to do with the deity's identity whatsoever.
Or even if it's different from person to person. You know, someone might respond better to a deity with a gender that aligns with their own.
So what do I mean here? Well, to get ahead of myself a bit, the point I'm making here is that we have no knowledge of the mind of the deity in question, any deity. Therefore, we can have no certainty on its identity. It follows that any subsequent interpretation is just that, interpretation. Now, we are people who have gender. This informs the way we look at things, especially other people. We, as theistic people, have a tendency to personify our gods. It follows that without that special knowledge, it would not be possible for us to tell if our deities actually have gender, or if we are simply assigning it because we have gender, and so we look at them through that lens. If a deity has gender, it also doesn't mean that they might alter their presentation for different people or over time, changing our own interpretations of that deity. The conversation then becomes, well, a claim for a deity to be transgender is unfalsifiable, but so is pretty much any claim in religion, so it's equally valid to hold it or not, but here's why I don't hold it.
That's not one that I particularly care for, just because it ascribes to the gods a very human construct of gender.
Right, which, when they don't have bodies, becomes like... Especially because I thought that the point that you brought up, which I hadn't considered, I had considered that they don't have bodies, so the transition from saying that a deity is trans, when you define trans as like being that gender and sex are not aligned or something like that, right?
Right.
Then, and then you say that a deity is trans, then you're saying that a deity has a referent that it doesn't have, and that's an interesting objection. I hadn't thought that through. Like I kind of thought, but it didn't like, well, maybe saying trans in this case doesn't fit. You know what I mean? It winds up just being like, well, by trans in this case, we mean that at one point there was one gender presentation, and at a different point there was a different gender presentation. But by some people's experience with transness, that actually conflicts. That's more of a gender fluid position rather than something there's the expression of transness.
It doesn't even have to be a gender fluid position, because what is core to this argument is that identity and expression are two separate facets of your gender.
That's true. Okay, I see what you're
Right.
saying.
And this is the meat and potatoes of my thought process. Gender identity and gender presentation are two very separate things. My presentation has no bearing on my identity. I can present however I want to and still be a woman. But my identity may have some impact on my presentation, but by no means is it definitive or constraining factor. It's descriptive, not prescriptive in function. If a deity changes presentation over time, and we are willing to ascribe it gender, that change in presentation has no bearing on its identity. So when we look at presentation as if it's identity, what are we really doing? You can't judge a book by its cover.
In my head, my biggest issue with this is it would be completely indistinguishable for us to understand whether or not a deity has a gender and is presenting to us with this gender, or if it is us interpreting them because we have gender, we are assigning gender.
Right.
There's no way to tell the difference between the two. It would be functionally impossible unless we had some insight to the mind of the deity.
Which we don't. So
Right.
Right.
So, in what you were saying a second ago, I get the logic of there's no sex, so transition is even easier. But that also becomes to conflate things like a sex change having to be part of transition. Like it's very lovely. It looks great on the surface, and then the second you start digging into it,
see the consequences that kind of fall from it. I can see how that might
it
be an issue.
reinforces some really toxic aspects of society in the way that we see gender.
The convo here gets a little bit muddled by me, and then we pick back up looking at spirits that have definite gender in myth and folklore and how all of this interacts with the soul.
You do have feminine spirits that are seen as feminine, but you still have that same problem, right? With them, where if you don't have access to their mind, you only have access to their presentation.
Right.
So, but they're regarded as feminine. So, and I think in a lot of cases with the Disir, they are ancestors.
Right.
And you could probably throw a fun wrench into this conversation. Could you have a trans woman Disir?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting looking at it theologically, because then you start to ask, does the soul have a gender?
Right.
And
Right.
is that a part of your this is part where I'm very bad with terms. Not part of your hoiyeah, but part of your whatever.
Owned or no, you're talking about like are you talking about which one are you referencing, the force of life or the mind or the memory or
the mind?
Yeah. So would gender be seated in one of the parts of the soul?
Right.
Yeah. And is that part of the soul the part that may become a guardian spirit?
Exactly.
Yeah. And okay,
And is gender a part of the soul? Because it is as well, impacted by culture.
And if it is part of the soul, is it part of one part and not others?
Right.
Yeah, there's no answers for this one. Well, presumably there is an answer, but we can't know it. So whatever floats your boat on that one.
The other half of this argument, right, is like saying that your this is through religious experience that you have determined that this god is this gender, or at least presents to you in this gender. Well, what you experience, right, with a deity is very often not concrete, right? It's not like I would argue for most people who are practitioners of the faith, they don't ever like see an image of their god.
Yeah, the experience of a Valkyrie coming down out of the sky, landing in front of you, and then having a coherent conversation is not one that I have seen commonly described among humans. So
it's typically more of like a vibe, some kind of emotive feeling or a tactile function,
Yeah.
And then at that point,
feeling of a presence, and that presence has character to it, and
yes.
Yeah.
How do you define man? What is the definition of this deity gives me man vibes?
I think that the from what I've heard of this deity as trans vibes, it's usually of
Well, we can
one
even
of this
we can
deity
even
understands or identifies with this struggle or something like that, and that's the vibe. And I think like that could be, I think that's probably the best justification you could get.
yeah.
But it's still like what we were talking about. It has all the same limitations that we talked about at the initial part of this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't fix any of them. It's just the best justification you could probably get.
Right.
Everything you do impacts your worldview, even on the most minuscule level. When we hardline on gender with deity, we run the risk of reinforcing in ourselves the same biases we recognize as bad in other scenarios, but are giving a pass because it's a religious experience. Making a judgment about identity through presentation is something we do all the time, and so maybe toxic was the wrong word to use, but to claim that you have an experience with a deity and that experience led you to believe it is of one gender or another, in some ways forces you to essentialize that trait in which you found your interpretation in, as feminine or masculine or what have you. This is not to say you cannot have that interpretation, but you should interpret, but do so responsibly, and make sure you aren't reinforcing that essentialization of gender within yourself.
I want to like caution against like hampering interpretation entirely, though.
Right. No,
You
I'm
know
not
what I
trying
mean?
to say you can't
Like-
interpret deity, but when you
Well, any interpretation that you give is going to be through a cultural lens.
right,
You know what I mean? You're going to be bringing your cultural understanding and life experiences as a reference to whatever you're interpreting. So when you're interpreting deity, those things all kind of come with you, and gender is one of those things that's in that bag. So trying to, and I get that you should treat it maybe with some special care, but like removing it or not removing it seems to be just as justifiable as removing anything else.
yeah,
You know?
I'm not. Let me rephrase.
Sure.
I do not want anyone to feel like they cannot have that interpretation of their experience with deity, right?
Mhm.
How you interact with deity is deeply personal, and no one should be telling you how to interpret your experience.
Yeah.
But I caution to think about how you are interpreting it, because
Mhm.
or the methodology of your interpretation, because there comes a point where the way that you're interpreting this may be reinforcing something that you may not be intending to.
Right.
You know,
And I think that's one of those things that is kind of universally true with any tool that you're using to interpret.
yes.
And like
I feel
tempering
like
any
that
of your
temperament is not given to gender very often.
That's fair. I think that's definitely fair. I think that that tempering, honestly, in religious interpretation, that temperament is not given to most things. Although, I think you can pretty easily make an argument that gender is a special case with how that temperament seems to be excused or something like that, or sort of thrown out. But because like there's a lot of things that are kind of normal epistemic temperaments when it comes to things like dreams, for example. You kind of go, okay, well, that was a dream, so let's talk about it in terms of is it something that you should consider UPG, or is it something that you should consider just a fucking dream? And with gender, that temperament isn't commonly given. I think you're right. You know what I mean? So, but it's a temperament that should be given more broadly towards pretty much everything, gender included.
It's also yes.
Yeah. So
And it's the reason I argue for the I don't want to say special plea date, but it's essentially what it is.
special categorization, you could say.
Special categorization of gender is because of how much it's applicable to the way that you see other people, right? Because there are things that you may see as a characteristic of a deity, but the second you assign that characteristic to a gender, it's like, well, now you're informing your worldview on what, like, there's not much ways of getting around that.
Yeah. And you should avoid telling a deity what they are.
Right here, we take a turn away from gender and start looking at interpretations of experience as a whole for a bit and our own tendencies within paganism.
You know, I think that there is a habit within paganism generally to just kind of like see the suggestion of something and then run with it. And
because there's some idea of like, well, how much am I going to be able to find on my own? Because it is so what's the word? Intimidating to be there with all these variety of like textual sources, but then also know like, you know, maybe I can't take everything at face value.
Right.
But what can I take? And so there is a tendency within, I would agree that we take things and we run with it, especially when it impacts, or especially when it aligns with our confirmation bias, because we are people.
And that needs to be something that we keep an eye out for, because if we just take our confirmation bias and run, we can just, that's a system for bad conclusions.
Yeah.
And conspiratorial thinking and all of that other kind of shit. Like you wind up kind of like, not to say that anything that can open you up to something that has a bad conclusion is bad necessarily, but that having reasonable tempering toward things
you should
is a good way to combat that.
You should be willing to look and re-examine your beliefs,
right, on a regular basis. And that's something that, and if you're not prepared to do that, then you're gonna have a frustrating time.
You're gonna get bad results.
Yeah, and you're gonna wind up being a little gullible, you know, and that's not gonna be healthy for you.
So that kind of does it for the religion talk, and this last clip I want to show you is a tangent that we went on about Joan of Arc and the ethics of speculation and colonialist tendencies, and it's really good. I'm not going to interrupt this one because genuinely I've got no notes. Perfect conversation.
So at the risk of taking in a different direction, the conversation around Joan of Arc that became a meme recently, basically, like there was I'm not familiar with the specifics of everything, but there was a whole lot of discourse around apparently somebody depicted Joan of Arc as non-binary, and this upset a lot of people, you know, and caused a lot of conversation and so on. And my general take on it was that, like, from what I saw, is like art, exploring history through art is fine. Was Joan of Arc non-binary? She definitely upset a lot of gender norms when she, you know, according to the stories about her. But, you know, trying to frame her as non-binary may or may not be accurate. But in terms of exploring history through art, it can unlock some interesting conversations. So, you know,
part of the other conversation that happened there was like people saying that this is erasure of women. Or that this was a like Joan of Arc stood for, like, this is, you can be a woman and still have all of these things. Be this brave, courageous person,
right,
willing to fight. And by making it a non-binary identity, it's like a further essentialization of women as frail, or
just saying, because she upset these gender norms, therefore she's no longer a woman anymore, and that in itself is a problem, right? Like,
and it's,
go ahead.
It's moments like this where you have to look and you have to be like, you have to re-examine why you're coming at an issue, because if you're wanting to label Joan of Arc as non-binary for an exploration of art or an exploration of queer history, that's interesting. But are you, when you don't have any discussion from the person themselves, is it responsible to start speculating? Because they didn't have the term non-binary back then. There's no way for us to have known. One of our gender identity is.
I kind of brought this up in the Northman review, where I was like, you know, the character, the Sether practitioner with its wearing brooches and has there's a lot of like fashion styles that would reflect this person as being some historical representation of queer. But can you call that character that? Maybe that's the modern term that would fit them the most, but you have no idea because you don't know what that person would have looked at these terms and decided what fits them as far as a reflection of what's in their mind.
And this is
right?
This is a moment where I tell people to look around the rest of the world before we start digging in. Because if you look at other societies where there is like a third gender identity, most of the time they don't identify as like trans or queer.
Right.
Just who they are. It's a third gender. It's not anything LGBTQ. It's just culture. And so when we try to assign our own culture's terms onto something else, well, yeah, that might be the thing that most accurately describes them in our understanding of our language.
But it doesn't mean that's what it was. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Because like there's differences in what our understanding is and what their understanding is. And from
In
their
the same way
understanding,
that
it's
there's-
like, no, that's not what describes me. This is what describes me, this cultural term.
Right.
Thank you very much.
It's like there's a want for people to be able to identify with these figures in the past. But in the process, are you removing someone's right to self-identification, which I would hold as one of the most sacrosanct rights of any person, is the ability to define themselves. Or at least be able to identify themselves and have that respected. It is the minimal amount of autonomy you can provide a person.
So then does that mean exploring Joan of Arc as non-binary bad because it removes her narrative from the conversation? Or
The issue is we don't have her narrative.
right, but does that mean we have like her attestation? She referred to, like, I think that she referred to herself as a woman, but I don't know that, but like this is all the trial conversation I believe that we have related to her, which is written by people that were adversarial to her. So, there's a lot of like complexity in trying to have like a good discussion about Joan of Arc. And I think that's part of the reason why the exploration of her as non-binary might be interesting, but does that, what would she think about that? Would she say, no, I'm a woman, and that the accusation that I am something else is part of the problem I was dealing with? Like, that might be how she responds to it. It's
sorry, I'm gonna stop trying to talk.
No, good. Go for it.
That's exactly the point. The fact is that there's speculation for the point of wanting to understand in a modern context is useful for people to be able to understand things in a modern context. But at some point, you got to recognize these people don't live now.
Right.
They never did. Now never existed for them. They live within their own situation and they have a way of identifying themselves. It's like when archaeologists look at any kind of trance work practice and call it shaman.
Right.
It's the same thing.
It changes the meaning of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so like Emerald Hook in the chat, I see what you're saying, but LGBTQIA+ didn't exist. Was not a thing. Right? Or at least it wasn't a cultural thing. People were gay, people were queer, but they didn't identify as gay or queer. And so when we assign that upon them, are we actually just disrespecting their right to autonomy because, well, they're dead?
I think that in some cases, it winds up just being a description of behavior. Like, gay might just refer to homosexuality within a man, right?
Right.
And it's fairly, if you have like, on the basis of a behavioral analysis, you can go, okay, well, this figure in history was gay, even if they didn't identify as gay. A queer winds up having like a whole lot of other things sort of attached to it or not attached to it, and is a different case there, Right. It's not just a behavioral description at that point. It's something else. It's an
identifier.
It also has a self-identity attached to it too. So, like as a label, it winds up being more complex when you try and use it into history. Although there is a fun argument that I was reading that probably the best translation for the word ergi is queer. Which when I looked at the argument for that, I was like, that's not a bad analysis there. But also, how accurate is that translation?
Right.
Queer as a jumble, and that's part of the problem with it when you're trying to apply it to somebody in history, right? Is that since it's a jumble and since it doesn't have like necessarily a clear definition, you're not quite sure if it's identifying identity, something behavioral or something that's like part of cognition, and all those things seem to be tied to it, yet also not explicitly tied to it. It's a gradient term that is amorphous in and of itself, and purposefully so, but that creates complications when you start trying to apply it to people in history that didn't use the term for themselves.
Just the ethics of speculation on someone's identity is questionable,
right,
in my mind. There's nuance to be had here, clearly, but we love to assign our own cultural values onto other cultures, and our own, I guess, temporal values would be the right way to say that, into other times.
Yeah, a lot of people try to look at their subconsciously, they'll look at their own language as like an objective set.
Yes.
And then apply it onto other things.
That's what colonizers did.
Right. Because I was going to say, it winds up being colonial behavior, and it's something that a lot of people that are doing it with good intentions don't really realize what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll decry objections on that on the basis of like an anti-colonial argument. And they say, no, because I'm doing something that has like, socially tolerant values, you should put up with my colonizer crap.
Right.
It's just like, wait, hold on. This completely fucking fucks with everything. Stop it. But yeah, I don't know. There is room for nuance and complication in the conversation and like holding space for that. But it's sometimes complicated in a way that a lot of people aren't going to like to hear.
And that does it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Links to Ocean's Twitch and YouTube are below, though if you're seeing this, I'm under the assumption you already have seen the guy's work. As well as links to the Heathen Bitches podcast. Please check it out. I love my co-hosts, and I'm really proud of the stuff we got coming down the pipeline. Episode 1 is out now. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you want more content like this, hit that motherfucking subscribe button, and if you got thoughts on my thoughts or Ocean's thoughts from this vid, leave a comment. I'm sure I'll look at it and maybe give it a heart, or maybe tell you get fucked idiot, or whatever. It depends on what it is. Take care, y'all, and take it easy.
The videos are like really memey, and at some points I go overboard. Just deal with it, please. The next